Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
There's 1.5 tons of money they had to shift, and they're pretty exhausted, you can imagine. So when they got to Leatherslade Farm and unloaded all the money from the various vehicles, my dad said to Buster, "I'm going to go to bed now. Wake me up when it's counted."
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
In the last episode, we explored stories of criminals on the run and followed the 5-year flight from justice of the mastermind of the Great Train Robbery, Bruce Reynolds. In this episode, we're dissecting the robbery itself. In the 60s, money was routinely physically transported across distance and so was vulnerable to hold-ups. On August the 8th, 1963, a Royal Mail train was ambushed in Buckinghamshire. £2.6 million was stolen, equivalent to 70 million today. We'll explore how the raid was planned and executed, who made up the gang, and what happened to them. And we'll be talking exclusively again to Bruce Reynolds' son Nick about his father's role and the colourful gang he led. But first, Martin, you got to know Bruce Reynolds through your reporting and interviewing him on Sky. What struck you about Bruce?
Bruce was a very remarkable man. Unlike other villains I've known, much more than just a thief, that's for sure. He was a strategist, a storyteller, a gentleman bandit, if you like. He was different. In 2000, he arrived at the Sky News studio, immaculate as ever in a tailored suit and polished shoes, as always, and he helped us dissect a failed £200 million diamond raid at the Millennium Dome. He'd agreed to analyse the footage of the heist, and we watched as his eyes lit up.
Do you think in some ways perhaps he saw some parallels between the Dome raid and his own?
Certainly in terms of the gang's ambition, the Dome robbers, like his own, aimed for what Bruce called the El Dorado of crimes. He said, doing what people haven't done before. Another thing I vividly remember, at one point, he paused the tape, adjusted his spectacles, and talked about the nausea that robbers feel just before a job. He told me, if you're a thinking man, you ask, what am I doing here? I've got a wife and child. Bruce remembered what he described as the terrified anticipation before the Great Train Robbery. I'm going to read a brief bit from Bruce's autobiography. It's called The Autobiography of a Thief. And the reason I'm keen to read this is that the day after Bruce died, Nick rang me and we were reminiscing, and I'd said to Nick that I was so moved by passages in Bruce's book. And I compared it to one of my favourite writers, Laurie Lee, who wrote a beautiful book called As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning. And it was the opening that really gripped me. And Nick said, "Oh, you must read that at my dad's funeral." And I ended up doing it. But just listen to a couple of lines from the prologue of Autobiography of a Thief by Bruce Reynolds. This is just moments before the Great Train Robbery. The August moon was as white as a £5 note. Parking the Land Rover off the road close to the abutment of Bridego Bridge, I clambered up the embankment, slipping several times on the damp grass and loose rock. At the top, I paused to take a piss. It was more than just relief. Perhaps subconsciously, I was establishing territorial boundaries, like a tomcat or a lion. This was my domain. I knew this would be my greatest moment, a night to remember. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, my life would never be the same again.
And it wasn't, was it, Martin?
It wasn't. And how poetic, what a beautiful way of describing the feeling just before the robbery happened. The clarity, the focus, all came rushing back, he said. You hope your security's good. If there's a leak, you abort. But once the die is cast, your head clears. You're in the zone.
Let's get into the zone ourselves, because Bruce's son Nick is back in our True Criminals studio with us. It's lovely to have you here. Nick, do you remember Martin reading that passage from Dad's autobiography?
I do indeed. It's as clear as yesterday, actually. I was determined that my dad would get a decent send-off, and it was absolutely fantastic, the church. It was St Bartholomew's, near Smithfield Market. And the reason I chose that place, I realised he wasn't going to get a send-off at Westminster Abbey, but it looked like Westminster Abbey. But the only reason that this church was still in existence, because obviously Henry VIII had gone on the warpath, and when he took over the head of the English church and demolished all the Catholic churches, except for this one, because this St Bartholomew's was owned by the Mr Big, the Billy Hill of his day, if you like, and Henry VIII didn't want to mess with him, so he let this villain keep his church. So I thought it's the perfect place for my dad's funeral. But yeah, no, I remember it very clearly, and I was very appreciative that Martin came down and read that bit.
And you remember the funeral very clearly too, Martin. We chatted this morning over coffee about it. You were quite moved and taken by the whole service.
I was very chuffed to be asked to do it, because I was in hallowed company, wasn't I? Because not only did Nick's band Alabama 3 play this rather beautiful, sad song called Too Sick to Pray.
That's right, yeah.
The stage I also shared with John Cooper Clarke, the poet, who wrote a poem.
Oh, he did. Bruce Reynolds, Gentleman Thief. The light touch was his leitmotif.
and David Thewlis, very famous actor, who just finished a big movie on which your dad had acted as a consultant.
That's right, yeah, Gangster Number One, I think was the film. It was obviously very emotional for me as well. And my godfather, Freddie Foreman, he was there as well.
Ronnie Biggs?
Yeah, Ronnie Biggs. Bless him, because there must have been, I don't know, over 100 press outside. I'd made it quite clear I wouldn't allow any journalists,
apart from me,
other than you and Duncan Campbell, in the church. So the rest of them are all outside trying to get what they could. And Ronnie, being Ronnie, he turned up with his mate Chris Pickard, who was pushing him in the wheelchair. And as soon as Ronnie saw all the journos, of course, he gave them the V sign, didn't he? In typical Biggsy defiance. As funerals go, it was ultimately a very sad and tragic event. I wasn't expecting my dad to suddenly die the way he did, but he had a great send-off, and even today, when I run into people, that they still say that is one of the best funerals they've ever been to. In fact, I remember reading a newspaper article, an interview, John Cooper Clarke, and it said, "Do you remember when the last time you cried was?" He said, "Yeah, Bruce Reynolds' funeral."
Really? Wow.
It was a sad and glamorous occasion, but it was also very honest, though, wasn't it? I mean, I remember you in your eulogy, that phrase you used, that your dad had chosen the lunatic path.
As I've always said, he was a romantic character. Anyone who describes their biggest crime, which in his case was the Great Train Robbery, as his Sistine Chapel, they're coming from a different place. You're talking about that anticipation before a crime, that feeling you get in the pit of your stomach as the adrenaline builds and everything. I remember him saying that when he was younger, he was possessed with the same kind of madness that people have got to do to be able and to want to climb the north face of the Eiger. And that kind of summed him up. There are some nutters out there when you see these people free climbing or these people bungee jumping or whatever. You know, there's some people out there who just really push themselves to the limits. And he obviously was one of those characters.
And he did climb his Eiger, didn't he?
Well, he did. He did.
Your dad wrote in his 1995 memoir, "We rehearsed for months, but nothing prepares you for the moment the train stops and the clock starts ticking. There was a gang of 15 in total on Bridego Bridge on the 8th of August 1963, this moonless night that we've talked about in Buckinghamshire." I suppose I'm trying to picture the essential stages of the robbery. How did they do it, Nick? How did they stop the train, or had the train come to a stop anyway?
This is why there was two gangs involved. My dad had been told about the Up Special, the Glasgow money train as it was known. And it has been known for years that it carried money, but nobody knew how much. And nobody knew how to stop it. But there was a gang called the South Coast Raiders that had just started having some kind of success with stopping trains. Originally, the way they would do it was just to pull the emergency cord. My dad did a trial run with that one time with him, Gordon Goody, one of the train robbers, and Charlie Wilson, another one of the train robbers. And they managed to get the train to stop. But by the time it had stopped, it was about half a mile away from where their cars were parked. And they got these big, heavy bullion boxes out the thing and tried to drag them back. And obviously, I think only Gordon was strong enough. He managed to get one box back. And when they opened it up, there was about 15 grand in it. So they were very disappointed anyway. And they thought, well, this isn't going to work. We need something that's going to be more accurate, more in control. And so he went to this guy, a guy called Roger Caudry, who was the main guy of the South Coast Raiders, and said to him, "I hear that you've got some success. You know how to stop a train without it setting off any alarms in the control offices. How do you do it?" And he said, "Well, I'm not going to tell you that." He goes, "But I'll do it with you if we can come on board." And the deal was he would have to bring his firm with him. And my dad didn't really want this guy's firm, he just wanted Roger. But when they realised how much money was going to be on it, they needed bodies just to shift the thing. Now you've got to remember there was 120 people on that train against 16 robbers.
What happened at that point?
There was 2 Land Rovers and a big truck, big flatbed truck. One Land Rover and the big truck was pulled up by Bridego Bridge. This was the point where they were going to unload the money from the train. But they stopped the train at Sears Crossing. That was done with my dad and my Uncle John. They went off on a Land Rover for about a mile down the track and cut the telephone cables. And there's 2 signals. There's a dwarf signal and the main signal. So my Uncle John, he took on the dwarf signal. It was quite simple. They used a glove, a leather glove. You would put that over the green light, so that would then go dark, and then you'd connect a battery to the red light and you'd get a red light. So the dwarf was the signal before the main signal. So as the train was driving, the dwarf signal would be showing red, which meant, aha, slow down, there's going to be another red signal coming up. And that was the main one. So my Uncle John took care of that one. The main one was done by Roger Caudry, who was the head of South Coast Raiders. He was the guy who'd figured out how to do this method. So when the train saw the 2 signals, obviously it slowed down until it came to a halt, where the robbers basically just jumped onto the train, disconnected it, and then made it go down to the rest of the track, down to Bridego Bridge. And so a mile away were all the postal sorters, all the workers, had no idea till one of them thought, "What, we've been here a bit, what's happening?" Poked his head out the window and went, "Hold on, the engine and the money. Oh, the train has disappeared." That was like a mile down the track. Now, those guys quite easily could have come out of that train and run down the thing. The robbers wouldn't have had a chance, which is obviously why my dad had put the 20 minutes, thinking, right, 20 minutes and then we're out of here.
And they're in fake uniforms at this point.
Basically, there was an army base nearby, and so my dad thought if they're wearing kind of army clothes and stuff like that, people are just going to assume a convoy of Land Rovers and a bunch of guy in army clothes would just be night manoeuvres. So they drove there in army gear, but then they had overalls which they put on top of thingy when they actually did the train robbery.
And when they attacked the train, this is where the first big mistake that threw a shadow over this whole idea of the People's Robbery.
Jack Mills.
An attack on Jack Mills.
My dad had made it quite clear, no violence, because with violence you get a higher tariff. So there wasn't supposed to be any violence at all. It was just the threat of violence and intimidation. My dad always thought that violence was inefficient. He wasn't that guy, but there were some heavies, particularly the South Coast Raiders. I'll say that my dad's style of robbery was more about finessing and stuff, whereas the South Coast Raiders, they were more heavies, and a bit of violence was just part of the game for them. But it was a complete accident. What had happened is that when the train stopped, the first one up the ladder was Buster Edwards. And Jack Mills saw him and went and kicked him in the face. And as this happened, and he's kicking Buster, behind him, on the opposite side where the other ladder is, Gordon Goody came up. And so he's grabbed hold of Jack Mills, who's kicking Buster, who's trying to desperately get on the train. And Gordon's job was just to put his arms around him and hold the driver. But for some reason, Gordon grabbed him and spun him round to the next guy coming up the ladder. And the next guy coming up the ladder, don't know why he did this, instead of him grabbing him, he clumped the driver over the head. And this bloke, as one of the three who got away, was the least known to any of the other members. And he was only brought in, they needed an extra body. So it was totally ridiculous, unnecessary, because even though they had a spare driver, you don't want to knock out the driver in case your driver can't get it working. You don't nobble your other opportunity. So it was a total accident. But it was really overplayed by the establishment. They made a big deal about it. And I've seen plenty of documentaries where his children have said he was shattered, Jack Mills, and he was never the same afterwards. And I believe that, but not because of the violence that was done to him. He died 7 years later of chronic lymphatic leukemia, and the coroner said at the time he was aware of Jack Mills's involvement in the train robbery and that he had sustained an injury to his head, but it was in no way connected to his death. Having said that, I've even read things where it said that Ronnie Biggs killed the train driver. But the establishment needed a big hook if they wanted to hang a 30-year sentence on. And they didn't really have very much except for the blow on the head to Jack Mills. Now, back in those days, I'm not advocating violence in any way, but back in those days, a blow on the head was nothing. The police would give out just as much. And he actually did say, but it was taken off the record, that the damage done to him wasn't when he got hit by the train robber. He actually fell and he cut his head on the dashboard. And he was told to take that out of his statement, otherwise he'd lose his train pension. And also they had to make out that he couldn't drive a train anymore, that he was crippled as a result, which he wasn't. And they put him out to shunting trains for the rest of his life. So he was very unhappy about that. He had to lie in court, which he wasn't happy about. He'd been threatened with his pension, and he realised as he's in court that he was being used to elicit this 30-year sentence. So for the rest of his life, he was looking over his shoulder thinking there was going to be some retribution, because they offered him money. When my dad's Land Rover came back and all the guys were unloading money, and he saw Jack Mills sat on the embankment with a bandage on his head. And my dad had a chat with him, said, "You all right? What happened there?" And didn't think nothing of it. It was just like, thingy, give him a hack, and he fell over. And it was like, "Okay, do you want some money? You all right?" Blah, 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 blah. And originally he actually said to Peter Fordham, she wrote a book about it. She was a wife of one of the barristers at the train robbery court case. And he said that they were like gentlemen and had offered him money and everything. But of course, the establishment had to take a different angle on that.
But your dad recognised what difference it made, the injury, however it happened.
My dad, he was mortified.
He said blood changes everything.
Yeah, no, it does. For my dad, it ruined what would have been the perfect caper. That was always something he was bitterly disappointed and thought spoilt the whole thing, was the fact that there was violence. It was unnecessary, completely unnecessary.
And the money was the equivalent to about 70 million in today's...
But 1.5 tons worth of weight. And my dad had worked out, I don't know how, but he'd worked out, we got 20 minutes, that's it. As soon as that's over, we're out. So they even left money behind.
Did they?
But I think doing it in the countryside, straight away after the robbery, police stations were going mad. Loads of people calling, they'd seen this, they'd seen that. And actually, this sheep herder, a guy called John Maris, had noticed there'd been a little bit of activity, and he was a bit nosy, and he'd gone up there and had a look. And he noticed the Land Rovers, and he peeked through the things. He thought, oh, this is interesting. So he called the police. But they had so many tip-offs, it was 2 days before the local bobbies thought, let's follow this little bit of information up. So they went to the farm, and this is where things could have ended up so differently. But there was a guy called Lenny Fields, and he'd been paid to go and get rid of the only thing that could track them to the train robbery was the mail sacks and the little paper strips that were wrapped around the notes. They had tried burning them at one point, but they thought, no, it's giving off too much smoke, and nosy people might think, like, what's happening there? So they decided, contrary to popular belief, the farm was never meant to be burnt down. My dad was confident because him and 7 others, all in a chain, had wiped down every service. If you look at all the pictures of the farm, it looks like a museum. Everything was put together so neatly, all the tins and everything. The place was immaculate, and so as far as my dad was concerned, there wasn't any evidence there except for the paper wrappers and the actual mail bags. And this guy had been asked to go down and to remove these, but he'd got arrested for something else. And the robbers weren't to know about this until they heard it on the radio that the farm had been discovered. And they were like, well, did Lenny get a chance to go there and get rid of the bags? And it was like, well, we don't know where he is. Oh, Lenny's in the nick. It's like, oh, no. And that's when it went wrong, really, from that moment. And they did start driving towards the farm, but then overheard on the radio that the police were there and decided they better turn back. And that's when it was like panic now, because the police had found the place. But my dad was still pretty confident that there wasn't any evidence. And if there was, it could only prove that they were at the farm. But there wasn't any evidence, no prints or anything, actually on the train. Once they got back to the farm, there's 1.5 tons of money they had to shift, and they're pretty exhausted, you can imagine. So when they got to Leatherslade Farm and unloaded all the money from the various vehicles, my dad said to Buster, I'm going to go to bed now. Wake me up when it's counted. so he went to sleep, and then Buster woke him up. And my dad had been told that there could be anywhere between 2 and 6 million on this train. And so when Buster woke him up and he said, how much was it? And Buster said, 2.6, Bruce. And my dad was like, thinking, he told some of the people it could be anywhere between 2 and 6 million. And he was worried, were they downstairs saying, bloody hell, Bruce said it's going to be 6 million, it was only 2.6. So he said to Buster, what do you think? And he goes, that'll do very nicely, Bruce. So my dad knew that everyone downstairs was pretty happy, but it suddenly hit him then. It was like, okay, we've got to divvy up the money now, but then there was a massive anticlimax. Well, how do you top that? What do you do next? Looking back at it, it was an insane thing to do. The fact that my dad thought he could just lay low for 6 months and it would blow over. They'd attacked the establishment so badly, and the fact that this came at a time when the establishment was reeling anyway because of the Profumo affair, and the tabloids were having the time of their lives shredding the government over the Christine Keeler affair with John Profumo, the war minister, who was also having it with a Russian military attaché who was linked to the KGB. It really shocked the cosy, leafy consensus of Middle England, who used to believe that the governments at the time were whiter than white people and altruistic, doing it for the good of the country. England was really, 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 really shocked, and the press had a field day taking the mick out of government and pretty much insisting that this government wasn't fit to be in power. And of course, when that was followed up with the train robbery, this was just another gift to the journalist. And so the government at the time had to put the kibosh on these guys at all costs. I think it was a terrific shock to them. They never thought crime could be organised to the point where someone would do something as big as that. And not only that, you got to remember, it was the Royal Mail. And once upon a time, the penalty for stealing Royal Mail was death. It was kind of shocking at the time. 30 years they were given, some of them. Now, murder, you only got 25 years if you killed somebody. But if you're a train robber, you got 30 years. It put out the wrong message. My dad always said that the government made a massive mistake there by putting on a tariff that large. It sent out a message that basically property was worth more than life. And there was almost a kind of dysfunctional logic where you could argue if you carried a gun, you got less chance of getting caught. And if you shot someone in escaping, you're going to get 5 years less than you get for not carrying a gun. So inadvertently, it brought in gun culture. Great Train Robbery was the last major robbery that didn't have any guns. All criminals carried guns after the train robbery. And inadvertently, by giving the train robbers a 30-year sentence, in the eyes of many people, it turned them into working-class heroes. They became martyrs. And England was divided at the time, saying 30 years, this is way too much. The only people who got 30 years at the time was if you were guilty of treason.
Sometimes the police have just 24 hours to gather enough information to charge someone who they believe has committed a serious crime. Could you gather enough information on motive, means and opportunity before the time runs out? If you're fascinated by true crime, then join us in June 2025 for CrimeCon London. Meet the biggest names in true crime TV, experience live forensic demonstrations, and dive deep into the criminal mind with your favourite authors, podcasters, and content creators. From cold case reviews to immersive sessions with crime scene experts and police dogs, this is your chance to be part of the UK's biggest true crime event. Go to crimecon.co.uk now to secure your tickets. CrimeCon London, partnered by True Crime Channel, June 7th and 8th, 2025. The clock is ticking. Find out more and secure your place now at crimecon.co.uk.
Step into the world of Cold War summitry with Creating History. From Kennedy and Khrushchev's nuclear brinkmanship to Nixon's high-wire act between Beijing and Moscow, and onto Reagan and Gorbachev rewriting the rules. Explore the handshakes, glares, and gambles of summits that redrew the 20th century. Stream Creating History now, wherever you get your podcasts.
They were punished heavily because it had been successful, the robbery, and it was successful because your dad principally had planned it so well, hadn't he?
Well, yes and no. The fact that he thought it would have died down, to have attacked the establishment like that, and then to have thought that he could have gone back to work in 6 months, I think was a major, major mistake. But as far as the actual robbery itself, there was no evidence at all on the train. In fact, if the Great Train Robbery had happened last week, should we say, and we're talking today, the police have just discovered Leatherslade Farm, and they're claiming that there's prints there and everything. All that would do today was prove that some of those people had been at the farm. You could not place any of them at the train. They would have all got away. My Uncle John got away because his prints were found on a Monopoly board, and they said that the board could have been taken there. Well, a few of the others could have had the same defence. It was unbelievable what they did at the time. And they put all their pictures in the paper saying these men are wanted. You can't do that today because you can...
Oh, prejudice.
Yeah, you prejudice the jury and things like that. But Tommy Butler made it quite clear when he sent in flying squad to Leatherslade Farm. He said, I want you to go in there and I don't want any of you to come out until you find something. And I know that it's highly contested by some people, but I do believe a lot of the evidence was planted by the police. It certainly was in the case of Bill Bowl, who was an innocent man who got arrested and died in prison. My dad, when he saw it on the news on television, he was like, who the fuck is Bill Bowl? He got 30 years, this guy. He had absolutely nothing to do with it at all, and the police fitted him up. They found yellow paint at the farm. They painted a bit of the little winding wheel on a watch fob and put it in his pocket. And he died in prison. Gordon Goody, who was one of the train robbers, but he was far too clever for the old Bill to get him. They broke into his house, stole a pair of his shoes and put the same yellow paint on it, and they framed him.
Can you tell us, Nick, a bit about the actual planning of it? Your dad led it. He spent months, didn't he, putting all this together,
Yeah, well,
and
he spent
planning it and gaining intel and...
Well, he funded it personally. He paid for the train robbery out of his own pocket. He went up and down the railway lines trying to work out where would be a good place to stop the train and unload the money. He went and found the farm, the Leatherslade Farm, where the robbers would plot up as the robbers' hideout. He loved planning, the finessing. That's what he liked doing. And I think everything was very, very well planned. But the biggest problem that they had was £2.6 million. In those days, the biggest note denomination of notes you had was a £5, it was white pound notes, I think they had then. So, am I correct there?
Well, as your dad said in the prologue to the book I read, the moon was as white as a £5 note.
Yeah,
so they were still in circulation, weren't they?
They were £5, but I'm not sure if they had, well, I don't know if there was £10 and £20 notes in there, but basically that amount of money, if you look at it, it is vast. We're talking about almost the size of this room, full of money.
Full of cash. It's cash, isn't it?
Yeah,
It was all cash.
Cash, yeah. And it's okay, how do we get this back to London? Now, once the alert had gone off, despite the fact that they cut the telephone wires, once the police had been alerted that this train had been stopped and this large volume of cash had suddenly gone missing, it was like, where do they go with it? Now, because there was two firms involved, and neither of the firms trusted each other. It wasn't like, well, we'll take the money, we'll count it up, and then we'll give you a bell tomorrow, and then we can split it. It's like, no, mate, we want to be there watching it get counted. So it's like, well, how could they do that? And Roy James, who was one of the train robbers, and he was also, would have been England's greatest racing champion. He was my dad's getaway driver. Roy James had just beaten Jackie Stewart's track record at one of the famous things.
Good choice for the getaway driver, I'm guessing.
Roy, yeah, but he was great. So how do you move the money? How do you divide it? How do you count it up? Roy suggested getting 10 Jaguars with all the boots ripped out and everything, and it would have been ridiculous. You imagine 10 Jags trying to drive into London, and then they got to go somewhere if they can count it. So the biggest weakness really was the fact that they had to have a place outside of London where the money could be counted up, and I think that's where things started going wrong. One of the robbers had said to one of the postal workers, "Don't move for 30 minutes." And in the press, this came out. Somehow it was mistranslated and gave the police the idea that they were living within a 30-mile radius, basically. And this is my dad's biggest mistake, thinking that you're out in the country, no one's going to spot you or anything like that. It's the opposite way round. They're bloody nosy country folk. You got more chance of hiding in plain sight. You're out in the countryside. They stood out like a sore thumb.
They sped off to Leatherslade Farm. It was a remote Buckinghamshire hideout, which I think had been rented under the alias Mr. Brown. What happened in those hours after the robbery?
Well, first of all, they'd already stocked the farm up with loads of provisions. They didn't really know how long they were going to be staying there for. They said they might even have to stay there up to a week. They were just going to play it by ear. So they had to get the supplies up there. And then the robbery was actually planned to take place on the 7th. And there was a phone box a couple of miles from the farm. And Gordon cycled up on the morning of the 7th. So on the 6th, the night of the 6th, Gordon cycled to the phone box and rang the lawyer who'd passed on the information and said, "Are we good to go?" And he said, "No, there's not as much money as I was expecting. It's going to be tomorrow. We reckon there's going to be more money on it." So Gordon had to go back and tell everybody, "Not tonight. They don't think there's the full amount on it. We'll try again tomorrow." So everyone, you can imagine, they're all holed up waiting to do it only for this anti-climax, and you've got to get all of that adrenaline up again for the second day. And then the second day, Gordon said, "Yeah, train's it's got loads of money, it's good to go." When they heard on the radio that the police were checking within a 30-mile radius, it was like, oh, bloody hell, what are we going to do? We need to start making plans to get out of here. So everyone had their own plans. This was where, I've been asked this many times, people thought that it was my dad's responsibility to have a get-out plan for all of them after the robbery, but it was every man for themselves. Once they'd been given their share, and it was all split equally, didn't matter what you did. My dad said everyone's just going to get an equal split. It was up to them what to do. And it was pretty chaotic. I think within the first couple of weeks, they caught most of the gang, particularly South Coast Raiders.
Can I ask you about some of those key characters who were involved in the robbery?
Yeah.
You've mentioned Gordon Goody. He was very well known to your dad. What had been their relationship up until then?
Well, basically, my dad's firm, it wasn't like a football team and he was the captain, if you like. They were a group where you could say they were all equals within their own self-beliefs, I guess. But my dad naturally saw himself, and people like to be led. If someone's prepared to do all the hard work, it's like, go on then, you get on with it. And they're happy to let you do that unless they think that they could do better. So he had a hardcore group that he'd been working with for years, and that was Charlie Wilson, who he'd grown up with as a kid, Gordon Goody, who he'd known for many, many years, Buster Edwards, all South London guys, and they'd known and worked with each other for like maybe between 5 and 10 years before the train robbery. They did the London airport robbery together previous to the Great Train Robbery. So it's pretty much the same gang that did the London airport robbery, which became known as my dad's gang. They then joined up with the South Coast Raiders and did the train robbery.
Buster Edwards was known, I think, as the enforcer, wasn't he? Was he a former boxer and quite a tough guy?
Buster, he was a lovable rogue. He was really nice, my Uncle Buster. Jolly, cheeky, chubby little chap. Diamond geezer. He didn't have a bad bone in his body. He wasn't an enforcer. He was completely non-violent. Although in the book by Piers Paul Reed, The Train Robbers, they got an absolutely massive advance. And part of the deal of them getting the advance was someone had to own up to who hit the driver, and Buster, being Buster, said, I'll say I did it. And it was the least likely person to hit anybody. Back then, all the kids from the East End or South London were in a bit of boxing or this, that. He did do boxing, but he wasn't a violent type. Gordon was a monster. Gordon was like 6'4". His shoulders were probably about 6 foot wide. He was described as having the head of a fox and the body of a bull. If anyone would be called an enforcer, it would have been Gordon, but not Buster. Buster, for those who know, was played by Phil Collins in the movie Buster, and he's playing pretty much what Buster was like, cheeky, chappy, lovable kind of rogue.
Did he have a flower stall at one point? I think I bought
did.
flowers from Buster
He had a
Edwards.
flower stall at Waterloo, and when I was in the Navy, I used to come from Portsmouth to Waterloo and get off, and there was a pub called the Wellington right opposite his flower stall, and I'd go and spend a few hours with him and reminisce. Yeah, I was very, very fond of him.
Charlie Wilson, was it his job to split the money and work out what they were going to do with it?
It's funny, the papers have always alluded to the fact that he was the treasurer. I don't know where these names came from. It's all fabrication.
Journalists, eh?
Yeah, bloody journalists, you know. So they like to give him certain names, like Roy James, his nickname was the Weasel, but it wasn't. That was someone else, but a journalist had got it wrong and the name had stuck and he hated it. Talking about journalists, this is how the Great Train Robbery, if it wasn't for journalists, they gave it the oxygen of publicity. Originally, it was called the Cheddington Mail Van Raid, which
doesn't sound quite as good.
Isn't that evocative, is it? It was some bright spark at the Daily Sketch, I think, who said, I know, why don't we, as a nod to Edison's 1903 film, The Great Train Robbery, why don't we call it that? And they even used Wild West font. And of course, that resonated with the British audience straight away, because in those days, you had the cinemas all day long in the West End were playing cartoons or cowboy and Indian movies. And for sure, Tommy Butler, the head of the flying squad, saw himself as the sheriff and the flying squad was his posse. And he was after his gang of outlaws and he loved Westerns. So England was pretty much tuned in and thought that the American Wild West and Westerns were awesome. So once they'd used this old Western font and alluded to this being like England's Jesse James and the train robbers of old, obviously it inspired the journalists and it captured the minds of the public, obviously. But that's the journalists, as we're saying, they come up with these names like the Enforcer, Charlie Wilson, the Treasurer, but they weren't terms by any means.
What about Ronnie Biggs? Ronnie Biggs is a name that most of us are familiar with.
What a character. I could talk for a week non-stop. I used to go and stay with him in Brazil. such a funny guy. The guy could ream off hours of Shakespeare. Everyone used to make out that he was a bit of a clown, or the tea boy, if you like. But he was probably one of the smartest guys out of all of the robbers. He was a mentor to my dad. When my dad first met him, Ron was a bit older. My dad had got a terrible beating by the police one day, and he was in his cell all battered and bruised. And through a very complicated system of swinging a tin with hot sweetened tea and evaporated milk on a bit of string through various landings, managed to get this cup of hot substance to my dad, and they became the best of friends. He had the smallest part of the robbery. The only reason he got involved is he rang my dad up to ask if he could borrow 500 quid for a deposit for a house. And my dad said, "I'm sorry, Ron, but I've just stuck all my money in this bit of work I've got coming up at the moment." And then Ron said, oh, can you put me in? And my dad said, "No, that's way out of your league." He says, "But I'm up in the area, I'll pop round and come and say hello." So my dad nips up to go and see Ron, and he said, "How you doing?" And Ron said, "Yeah, I'm all right." So I'm doing a bit of painting, decorating at the moment for a retired train driver. And my dad's ears pricked up, and he went, "Really?" And he said, "Do you think he can be turned?" He went, "Well, what for?" And so my dad gave him some of the details, and he said, "I'll find out." And he came back and said, yep. He goes, "I reckon the guy's game, he'll do it." So my dad brought Ronnie into the train robbery, and he didn't even set foot on the train, Ron. He watched the whole thing. He was sat in a Land Rover with the spare driver, just watching the whole thing play out before his eyes, and he ended up escaping, been on the run for 36 years, became the most famous of the train robbers, temporary lead singer of the Sex Pistols, kidnapped by Major Ron Ferguson, Fergie's dad, and the Masons and Jim Davidson. They all got together, and Tiny Rowlands, and they did the kidnapping of Ronnie Biggs. It was outrageous because he was earning money in Brazil. The journalists would just go out there and say, "Here's 500 quid, Ronnie. Can you do a V sign, wave a Union Jack and put a police helmet on?" And he was loving it. But of course, it wound up certain figures in England, and so they plotted his kidnapping, which just added to his fame. And then his son, Michael, he became famous. He was in he was on national television saying, crying his eyes out, saying, "I know the Queen wants my daddy, but I need him more." And the Brazilian people who love children went, "This is outrageous. We're not letting this man go back to England and desert his Brazilian kid. You know, he's staying in Brazil." And they basically brought him back from, I think, was it in Bermuda or Barbados?
Barbados, I think.
Barbados. Yeah. He was on death row in Barbados. They brought him back to Brazil, where he famously kissed the ground when he landed. And instantly his son became a star. And for 4 years he was on telly every day for 4 hours. I had a band called the Magic Balloon Gang, and they played the Maracano Stadium, which is one of the biggest stadiums in the world. He had the most incredible life. And all famous musicians, the Rolling Stones, the Police, anybody, Sting, that is the Police, not the old Bill. Any major bands that came to Brazil, came to Rio, all say, "We want to go and meet Ronnie Biggs, we want to meet Ronnie Biggs." And then coachfuls people would go and visit him. He used to charge $100 for like a beer, a hot dog, and like a half-hour chat about the robbery. And then you sell him a T-shirt. "I went to Brazil and met Ronnie Biggs, honest." And he had a great life. He really did.
You talked about Roy James, the getaway driver, but yeah. While we're on that subject of getaway drivers, can you nail the myth that the real getaway driver was Bernie Eccleston?
Right, okay, this is funny.
Bernie himself has actually talked about it.
Yeah.
So,
well, I met many times who were the missing members. And Bernie Eccleston's name, well, his name has come up a few times, that he could have been, it's like, where did he get his money from? How did he suddenly go from sort of being relatively unknown to being super rich? How did he end up running Formula One? And there was a rumour at the time that he was involved in the train robbery, as my dad was often fond of saying, just like the CIA, whenever he was asked, was Bernie Eccleston one of the robbers who got away? My dad said, like the CIA, I would neither admit or deny it. And, of course, this tickled Bernie, and so he played on that as well. And people say, "What's all this rumour about you involved with the train robbery?" "Oh, I'm keeping mum on that one." But the truth is, and how this came about, is when Roy James came out of prison, he wanted to get back on the racing circuit. and Bernie Eccleston took him on. And but unfortunately, he had a series of crashes. It was quite obvious that his racing days were over. And so as a bit of a consolation, Bernie asked Roy, because Roy had learned to become a silversmith while he was in prison, if he would make the silver cups for the race winners. And so he employed him through that, and they were friends. And it was through that association, the fact that Roy was known to be a mate of Bernie's, that whole... was Bernie one of the three that got away? But no, he wasn't, I can tell you.
When the police stormed the farm eventually, the forensics experts found 27 fingerprints, 16 matched the gang. Tommy Butler, the detective in charge, said at the time they left a trail of arrogance. Even the Monopoly money had their prints. From then on, the story became one of a manhunt, with Interpol and the tabloids closing the net. What do you think went wrong?
Well, no, because whatever evidence was at the farm didn't link anybody to the train. There was no fingerprints, nothing. They learned absolutely nothing from the train. And any evidence found at Leatherslade Farm, all that did was prove that they'd been at the farm. They could have been a delivery driver. They could have been anything. My Uncle John, his prints were found on a Monopoly board. And he said, yeah, I was playing Monopoly the week before. The board's portable. And most of the things it was found on was portable objects. But I know for a fact that a lot of that evidence was planted by the police. The fact that Bill Bowl went... My dad's prints were found on a tomato ketchup bottle, allegedly. My dad said he's never touched a bottle of tomato ketchup in his life. And you've got to remember as well that 3 people got away. And the reason they got away, and I don't think this is common knowledge, well, I know for a fact how 2 of them got away. They paid their money back, half of it. Freddie Foreman was who acted sort of as a go-between with Scotland Yard and the robbers. He was told that Tommy Wisby was in the frame and they would take him out if he gave back 70 grand. And Fred went to go and see him, and Tom said, fuck off, they got nothing on me. And then his print remarkably turned up on a bath rail that my dad and 6 other people had wiped down. So it wasn't a case of arrogance. As far as everyone was concerned, yes, if there's any evidence found at the farm, it just proves that they were at the farm. Doesn't prove they had anything to do with the train robbery. If it went to court today, I think they would all get off with it. They would just get done for complicitness or something for being involved in the farm.
And you say each man to his own. Your dad, Bruce's plan was to head off to Mexico.
Well, it wasn't. His plan really was basically just to lay low. They thought that it would die down, which I think that looking back at it was insane. He was just going to lay low for 6 months and then carry on as normal. The thing is what my dad did, whenever he did a robbery, annual wanted for questioning, he'd make sure he wasn't there to be questioned. And just bugger off to the south of France for a little while. And then when he came back, he knew the police were busy on other stuff. And he thought it was just going to be the same as that. But it wasn't. Once the first guys got nicked and then they got the 30-year sentence, my dad was like, oh my God, this is really, really turned super nasty. I need to get out of the country now. But that was never his plan at all.
Hold that thought there, Nick. It's been really fascinating hearing the story of the Great Train Robbery from your rather unique perspective. And we're going to continue our discussion in the next episode, looking at the aftermath of the robbery and how it's been reflected in the media, popular culture, and also in your art. Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.